A gray morning hung low over the city as Daniel Reeves, a ride-share driver who carried more exhaustion in his eyes than he ever admitted, started his shift with the same guarded spirit he had lived with for years. A spirit shaped by disappointment, long nights, and the silence of a son he no longer spoke to. He used to be hopeful. He used to pray. He used to believe that broken things could be mended. But life had pressed hard on him, and he grew cynical, convinced that God's voice was for others and never for him. He slid into his car, glanced at the empty back seat, and murmured to himself that today would be no different. He would drive strangers, listen to traffic, ignore the ache in his chest, and pretend the world had not become smaller since the day his son walked out after their worst argument. That argument replayed inside him more often than he allowed himself to admit. A twisted memory carved with guilt, sharp words, and a slamming door. He shoved it down like he always did and began driving through the soft drizzle. Hours later, after several silent passengers and one talkative tourist he barely acknowledged, he picked up an older man in a brown coat, gentle in posture, quiet in demeanor, eyes full of something peaceful that Daniel didn't understand. The man offered a small smile as he entered the car, nodded politely, and said almost nothing during the ride except a soft thank you when he stepped out at a modest church on a narrow street. The door shut with a muted thud, and Daniel continued driving, unaware that something had been left behind. It was not until 2 stops later, when he stretched in his seat and glanced at the rear floor, that he noticed a folded piece of paper resting where the man had sat. Its edges frayed, ink faint as if written long ago with trembling hands. Irritation rose in him at first. He hated forgotten items. They slowed his day. They reminded him of mess. Yet when he picked it up, intending to toss it aside, he paused. Because the handwriting looked strangely familiar, raw, human, broken. He opened it. Inside, written in uneven strokes, was a psalm he had not read in years. A psalm he once whispered with his son when the boy was small and would crawl beside him during storms. Even in the valley of deepest shadows, I will not fear, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. His breath hitched. His chest tightened. He reread the lines, unable to look away. These words were not just scripture. They were the words that had haunted him for months, ever since the nightmares began. Nightmares in which he found himself standing in a valley, reaching for his son through darkness he could not cross, calling out but hearing nothing in return. In the dreams he always woke trembling, heart pounding, feeling as though God himself was trying to tell him something. But he never listened. He stared at the psalm, tracing the ink with his thumb, unsettled by the timing. It felt like an intrusion. It felt like a message. It felt like a memory that refused to die. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was coincidence, but the words clung to him like a whisper he could not ignore. Why would that passenger leave this? Why this psalm? Why today? He placed the paper beside him, intending to return it later. But every mile he drove afterward felt heavier, as if the quiet voice he had spent years drowning out was rising again. That night, when his shift ended and the city lights flickered across the wet streets, Daniel sat alone in his parked car, staring at the psalm under the dim glow of the dashboard. He said aloud, though no one was there, that he was tired of running from everything that hurt, tired of pretending he didn't miss his son, tired of holding on to pride that had only turned his home into an empty place. The psalm reminded him of nights when his son, little and afraid of thunder, would crawl into his room holding a flashlight, asking his father to read the verses that promised protection. Daniel would wrap his arms around him and whisper that God never left his children alone. Yet somewhere along the way, Daniel forgot his own words. As rain began tapping softly against the windshield, he felt something break inside him, a soft cracking of a wall he built long ago. The wall that kept him from forgiveness. He whispered into the dim car, asking why the psalm had returned now, after he had spent years avoiding every sign that led back to faith. And though he heard no audible reply, the silence itself carried weight. He suddenly felt that the psalm was not left by accident. It was placed, delivered, timed, a gentle nudge from a God he thought had stopped speaking to him. A God who knew his valley better than anyone. Daniel reached for his phone with trembling hands. He stared at his son's number, one he had not called in 3 years, one he once memorized before bitterness stole that closeness. He hesitated. Fear rose, shame rose. What if his son rejected him? What if the call reopened wounds? What if it was too late? But the words of the psalm pressed into him, "You are with me." And for the first time in years, he believed they might still be true. He dialed. The ringing felt endless. Then a quiet voice answered. His son sounded older, tired, cautious. Daniel froze, unable to speak at first. Then he whispered an apology so raw and unguarded that his voice cracked. He told his son he had been wrong, that he missed him, that he carried regret heavier than any burden. There was a long silence on the other end, the kind that could break a heart or heal it. Then his son began to cry, soft at first, then shaking with years of grief. He said he had waited for this call, prayed for it even when he no longer hoped it would come. In that moment, something mended between them, not fully, not instantly, but undeniably. A bridge rebuilt plank by plank through vulnerability neither expected. They talked for hours. About pain, about misunderstandings, about love neither of them lost, only buried. And when Daniel hung up, the city outside seemed less dark, the air less heavy. He lifted the folded psalm, now damp from his hands, and held it to his chest. He whispered gratitude, unsure if it was to the passenger, to the stranger who carried quiet peace, or to the God he thought had forgotten him, but who, he now knew, had never stopped pursuing him, through shadows and silence. The next morning he drove back to the church where he had dropped the passenger off, hoping to return the paper. But the man was nowhere to be found. The pastor said no one matching his description had been there that day. Daniel walked back to his car with a tremor of awe. Somehow he felt the psalm was never meant to be returned. It was meant to be received. It had fulfilled its purpose. From that day on, Daniel placed the folded paper in his dashboard, not as superstition, but as remembrance. He began attending church again. He began sending messages to his son every morning. Slowly, his home softened, his heart softened, his life softened. The nightmares faded. The valley in his dreams grew lighter. And though he never saw the passenger again, he believed the man had been sent, whether by chance or providence, to deliver a reminder he desperately needed. A reminder that God enters our darkest roads with a whisper, a psalm, a gentle nudge that leads us back to love. He would often think of that moment. The quiet passenger, the folded note, the scripture that matched the ache he tried so hard to hide. And every time he did, he felt again the truth he once taught his little boy during storms. The truth he now lived by. God never stops seeking his children. Even when we stop seeking him, God never leaves anyone in the valley. God never turns away from the heart that trembles toward healing. And sometimes all it takes is a forgotten psalm on a worn car seat to open a door that has been locked for years. Welcome, dear friend. This is Faith Light Stories, where every story reminds us that God never leaves us. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below and tell us where God has met you in your own valley. Your story may be the light someone else needs today.